Welcome to this episode of our Revelation and End Times Bible study. This Bible study where we are focused on what the Word of God says about prophecy and how that relates to the end times events. Wherever you're joining us from today, welcome. Thank you for taking your time to be a part of this Bible study. Last time we had had the study a week ago. We had started talking about the book of Ezekiel. And in the book of Ezekiel, we are in particular looking at verses or chapters 37 through 39. So Ezekiel 37 through 39 is where we were looking at the coming back of the nation of Israel and a major war that is going to happen in the last days. And really, 37 through 39 are probably not the most accurate. I think we could do 36 through 39, and I would encourage you to go back and read chapter 36 because it really sets the stage for what's going to happen in chapter 37 that I discussed last week. In fact, what I'd like to do is just go through and discuss a little bit of 36. Let me read some of the verses just to help us understand the context of all that is happening. And so in chapter 37, here's what we find. And I want to pick it up in verse 16 of chapter 36, and I want to read all the way through the end of the chapter. And I don't want to spend a lot of time discussing it, but I do want to talk a little bit about it. And so I want you to keep this in mind that Ezekiel wrote these words somewhere around 600 to 570 AD. That's when these words were written by Ezekiel. So somewhere around 600 to 570 AD. So this was well before any of these events happened. These are a foreshadowing events that are going to happen really about 2,600 years from the time that Ezekiel wrote these. So let's just look and see what it says. And this is again setting the stage of what's going to happen. And I want to highlight some of the stuff in here. So Ezekiel says this, the word of the Lord, the word of Adonai came to me, and he said to me, Son of man, when the house of Israel lived in their own land, they defiled it. So just note this. So God says, when they had the land, they defiled it by their way, and they defiled it by their deeds. So those are the things that he's saying. They defiled it by their way and by their deeds. So as a result of what they had done, so as a result of them defiling it, God says, I'm going to pour out my fury on them for the blood which they had shed upon the land, and because they had defiled it with their idols. So Israel had let in a lot of idolatry. They had defiled what God had given them. They had turned their back on God. And so God says that here's what's going to happen then in the end days. I am going to scatter them among the nations. So I'm going to scatter them among the nations. And that's exactly what happened in the nation. Israel would be scattered. So they were dispersed through the countries. So ask yourself this question, did that happen? If things happened according to what God had said over, 2,600 years ago, God said this is what's going to happen. If that happened, then we have to take seriously everything else that he said, because if he's going to say one thing is true, then we have to believe him for everything else that is true. So God says, I will scatter them among the nations, so they were dispersed through the countries. According to their way and their deeds, I judge them. Wherever they went among the nations, they profaned my holy name. So wherever the Jewish people went, the followers of God went, and they weren't following God at that time. They were just going out as Jewish people. Wherever they went among the world, among the nations, they profaned my holy name, since all of these nations that they went to said about them, these are the people of Adonai, yet they had to leave his land. So basically, the other nations are looking down upon the Jewish people. So they are scattered throughout the world. Other nations are looking down upon them. Ask yourself the question, did that happen? Well, the answer is absolutely yes, it happened. The Jews have been despised everywhere they have gone throughout the world. They have faced anti-Semitism. They have faced ridicule. They have faced physical harm everywhere they have gone throughout all the world. They've always been looking for a home. So no matter where they went, no matter what communities that they were in, they were always judged. They were always defiled. Everywhere they went, they profaned my holy name. So they were a black mark on my name, God says. But God says, verse 21, but I had concern for my name. I wanted my name to be held in a good reputation, not a bad reputation, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations wherever they went. So God is going to say, essentially, I am going to look at and figure out, I'm going to restore my name. Everywhere they went, they were a black mark on my name because of the ways that they were living, because of what they were doing, because of the attitudes that they had. I'm going to go and restore my name among the nations. So that's verse 16 through 21. And then it says in chapter 36, verses 22 through 23, therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says Adonai Elohim, I do not do this for your sake, house of Israel, but for my holy name. This is my motivation. I want people around the world to realize who I am. You're not my representative. I don't want them to think that you are the ones that are representing who God is, because you have profaned my name. The act of hypocrisy. We see this happen in the church all the time too, that people through hypocritical attitudes and hearts and actions, other people who don't know God think that God is a certain way based upon the actions of some Christians. That's not true. People around the world have thought, well, this is the way God is based upon the actions, the hearts, and the attitudes of the Jewish people. Well, that's not true. God says, I'm not doing this for your sake. I'm doing this to restore my name. I will sanctify my great name. What does the word sanctify? It means to be set apart. I will set apart and proclaim as holy my great name, which you Jewish people have profaned among the nations, which you have profaned among them. The nations will know that I am Adonai. It is a declaration of Adonai when I am sanctified in you before their eyes. So God's purpose is not about the people as much as it is about restoring his holy name among the world. We should never think that God is a certain way based upon how any person acts. People will let you down. People will disappoint you. People will harm you. People will do evil against you. People will say all kinds of false things against you. But that does not reflect who God is. Just because people act a certain way does not mean that the God of the universe is that way as well. So God says, I will restore my name. I will sanctify my name, which all of you Jewish people have hurt. You've hurt my reputation because of the ways you have acted. It's not about God. It's about them as people. Christians do the same thing today. We hurt and we poorly represent the name of God through our actions. We have to reassure people that that's not who God is. God is not the same as the people who follow him, because we don't do it right and we don't do it well all of the time. So God says, I will sanctify my name. He then goes on to say to the Israel, now this is where the promise comes in. Now I want you to notice the couple of promises that God has already made. He will essentially scatter the people because of the ways that they have lived life. And the reason for the scattering is because they defiled the land that God had given them. They defiled it with idolatry. They defiled it with pagan worship. They defiled it with sinful, wicked hearts and attitudes and minds. They defiled it. Therefore, God was going to scatter them. They will be scattered until God promises this: I will gather you and I will bring you back to your own land. That is the promise. So I will bring you back. So instead of them being scattered, they are going to be gathered. That's what's going to happen in the end. They will be gathered. And they will be gathered where? In their own land, back in their homeland. So he will scatter them and then he will gather them. Now, again, we talked about that last week. That was from AD 70, where Rome utterly destroyed all of Israel, and they would not again have their home until 1948, when they were given back their land, and on a particular day they became a nation. And then another important date is in 1967, and that was the 6 Day War that happened. Through the 6 Day War, and they did not provoke the war. They were being attacked. They were attacked by Egypt, by Syria, by Jordan, and by Lebanon. And Iraq was in that as well. And when they were attacked, they fought back. And in 1967, they actually took ground. They took back Jerusalem that they had never had. So they were restored as a nation. They became Israel as a nation in 1948. They got their capital back in 1967. And then in 2017, when Trump declared that the U.S. Embassy would move to Jerusalem, out of Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it was the picture of legitimizing the nation and legitimizing Jerusalem. It was the first time that any nation had legitimized Israel as a rightful ruler of that land. And so everything now has been restored the way God promised it would. So in Ezekiel 36, he's giving the promise. I'm going to scatter you because you have defiled the land. You will not even rule this land again. In fact, the land of Israel was not going to be under Israel rule. Really, it was between about 580, 586, all the way until 1948 that Israel actually ruled their land. Because in 586, roughly, that's when the Babylonians came in and they took over, and they took control of the land. And that was followed by the Persians, and that was followed by the Greeks. Then it was followed by the Romans. So Israel never had control of the land. They were essentially allowed to be there. They were allowed to have a quasi-ruler, but they were being controlled by some other nation. Once the Romans destroyed Israel, then the land would lay desolate and actually be a wasteland, a barren wasteland, under the rule of the Byzantines, then under the rule of the Arabs, then under the rule of the Mamluks, and the Crusades were in the middle of all of that, where they tried to restore Israel. But then it would be under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Then it would be under the control of the British Empire until 1948, when the British were able to give it back to Israel. So Israel would be controlled by another ruling nation from 586 BC all the way until 1948. And so Ezekiel, again, that was written around the 570 to 600 mark. So that happened before any of this took place. So again, ask yourself the question, did this happen? And the answer to that is absolutely, without a doubt, yes, it did. Okay, if that happened, then we need to take seriously Ezekiel 38 and 39 and look at the war that is going to happen around that country. So God says, I'm going to bring you back to your own land, and I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean from all of your uncleanness and from all of your idols. Now that is yet to happen. Moreover, I will give you a new heart, Israel. I will put a new spirit in you. Now, we often take those verses and apply them to the Christian, which they do apply to the Christian. They're wonderful verses. In fact, those are the best communion and baptism verses that there are, that God will clean you. He will give you a new heart. He will put a new spirit in you. He will remove the stony heart from your flesh and give you a new flesh. I will put my ruach, my spirit, within you. Then I will cause you to walk in all my laws, so you'll keep my rulings and do them. Then you will live in the land that I gave to your fathers. You will be my people, and I will be your God. Now that, again, is a twofold thing that is being referred to by God. That is going to be the Jewish people, not all. It's going to be some of the Jewish people that will come to faith. And in the ones that come to faith, there will be a great awakening that will happen in Israel in the last days. So there will be a great faith that happens in Jesus. So some Jewish people will become believers. God will put a new heart in them, a new spirit he will give them. He will remove their stony heart. He will cleanse them from their unrighteousness. We will have that desire. They will have that desire to follow his laws, his rulings, and his commands. They will live in the land, and he will be their God, and they will be his people. So that's some Jewish, and then that is also all true Christians. All true believers are part of that promise, and they will live by faith. They have accepted Christ by faith. They will also have the new heart, the new spirit. They will be cleansed from unrighteousness and uncleanness, which we have. We will have a desire within our heart to keep God's laws, to keep God's commands. He will be our God. We will be his people, and that we will live in God's ultimate kingdom, his ultimate land forever and ever. So God is giving a future promise of what is going to happen. And all of this is a progression of the fact that they were scattered. Then they became a nation. They became a land, a people once again. Then at some point there's going to be this incredible revival. And the revival will be a people coming to faith before, and that will happen before Jesus returns. And God, when he returns, he will set everything right, and then that will kick off what's called the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ until the ultimate end of Satan, of the Antichrist, of those who don't follow God, for their forever punishment that will take place. And then you will have this eternity before us, eternity of the new heavens, the new earth, the new Jerusalem that will take place. And we can only imagine what that's going to be like. So that's the picture coming out of Ezekiel 36. So let me read just a couple more verses, and then we'll go back to Ezekiel 38 for today. So God says, "So I will save you from all your uncleanness. I will call for the grain and make it plentiful. I will not bring a famine upon you. I will multiply the fruit of the tree and the produce of the field, so that you will no longer bear the disgrace of famine among the nations. When you remember your evil ways and your deeds that were not good, you will be disgusted with yourselves because of your iniquities and your abominations." By the way, when you're a Christian, that becomes real. When you become a Christian and you think back and remember what you did prior to your Christian life, your evil deeds, your evil ways, all the things that were not good, you are disgusted with yourself. Do you ever have that happen? You look back at the sins in your life, the life that you have lived, and you're disgusted with some of the things that you have done. Well, that's what God's Spirit in us does. A new heart, a new spirit, a desire to follow him, being cleansed from all unrighteousness, creates in us a desire to be new and be different. And when we think back about the old life, it's disgusting to us. We can't believe we did that. We are so disappointed and saddened by our sin. We are broken over our sin. Well, God says this, "Not for your sake will I do." I'm not doing this for you guys, although you get the benefit. This is a declaration of Adonai. "Let that be known to you. Be ashamed and confounded for your ways, house of Israel." So God says, I will bring. Now, if you think about the nation of Israel, again, think about from AD 70, so from 70 AD all the way until 1948, the land of Israel was a barren wasteland. So it was a wasteland. There was nothing grew there. It was like a desert. It was good for nothing, is what it was. In 1948, when Israel came back as a nation, Israel has caused, well, really God has done this, but Israel has had incredible technological advances, agricultural advances, societal advances, so that Israel, the whole of the country is blooming. The whole of the country has the grain and the fruit. It has plentiful. There is no famine there like the rest of the nations. It is a protected place, a protected nation. So God again is promising this is what's going to happen, and it has happened. It has come true, and we can again, if God is, if he's fulfilled that, he's going to fulfill what he's promised later in Ezekiel 38, 37 and 38. Well, he's already done 37, so in Ezekiel 38. So let's, again, keep going. One last set of verses out of Ezekiel 36. Thus says Adonai Elohim, in the day that I pronounce you clean from all your iniquities, I will cause the cities to be inhabited and the ruins to be rebuilt. Well, that's what's happened. The land that was desolate, and it was a desolate wasteland, it will be tilled instead of being a wasteland in the sight of all that pass by. They will say, this land that was a wasteland has become like the Garden of Eden. The waste, desolate, and ruined cities are now fortified and inhabited. Then the nations that are left all around you will know that I, Adonai, have rebuilt the ruined places and replanted what was desolate. I, Adonai, have spoken it, so I will do it. So just again, just as a reminder, from that time of 1948 until where we are at today in 2021, God has, the land that was desolate has been rebuilt. It has seen tremendous growth. It has seen tremendous advancement. It has seen tremendous agricultural growth. It has seen technological, so the technology, the growth there technologically, it has been an amazing thing. If you look back and see what has happened in that place, it's all a fulfillment of what God said in Ezekiel 36. So let's keep going, and let's get in today to Ezekiel chapter 38. So just again as a reminder, 37 was the actual fulfillment of the prophecy, and that was in Ezekiel 37, where the dry bones came back to life, where the nation that had been divided in two had also been restored in one. Now, this is how we know that this could have never been part of prophecy that had been fulfilled already, because the nation of Israel was always divided in two. Since the time of David, who was before Ezekiel, David's son Solomon, Solomon's son Rehoboam, the nation split in two and it became Israel and Judah. So it became two nations at that time. But in Ezekiel chapter 37, it gives us the picture that when all of these things are going to happen, there will no longer be division. So that's why we know it could not have possibly happened up until now, because there was always division in the country with two nations of Israel and Judah. So now we know this has to be the fulfillment that we have seen in our lifetimes today. So let's jump into Ezekiel 38 and let's see what's going to happen, because God is going to do something against Israel in these last wars that will take place. So let's jump into that. Ezekiel 38 starts off this way. Now, again, remember, this is after Israel has been restored, that 1948, 1967. After it's been restored at the end times, this could not have possibly happened any time prior to this, because Israel had to be restored in a certain way at a certain time. Now that Israel has been restored, God's warning of a major battle that's going to happen, that there's this alliance that is going to invade the nation of Israel. There's debate among some theologians as to when this battle would be. This battle potentially could be one of the end times battles right after the abomination of desolation event, that it happens in the final 3.5 years of the tribulation. It's also possible that this could be a separate battle that happens prior to this, based upon some of the things that we will be reading about as we finish up and look through chapter 39. And so I'll talk about those two theories at that time. Regardless, there is this major battle that is going to come against the nation of Israel. We know that it cannot possibly have happened yet, because not all of the nations that are listed here, the regions, were ever a part of that. And so here's what it says, and we'll really break down and try to understand the areas and the regions that are being talked about and what this event is that is going to come against the nation of Israel. So it says, the word of Adonai came to me. That's again Ezekiel writing this. The word of Adonai, the Lord, came to me, saying, Son of man, Set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Prophesy against him, and say, Thus says Adonai Elohim, Behold, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws. I will bring you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them splendidly dressed, a vast assembly with breastplate and shield, all of them wielding swords. With them will be Persia, Cush, and Put, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his troops, the house of Togarma from the extreme north, and all his troops, many peoples with you. So let's talk about what this means and what all of this is. And let me show you what the lands are that are being discussed. Now, all of these in the day of Ezekiel would have not had the same names that we have today, but we can know the regions that all of these different lands were covering in the day of Ezekiel, and then put those regions on the map and say these are the countries that would fall into the same area that are being discussed in the day of Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel discusses that there's going to be an army. They're going to come out against Israel. And where are they going to be coming from? Well, he mentions these lands. He mentions Magog. He says Gog of Magog. Now, the word Gog is just ruler of. So the Gog, who is the ruler of Magog, he's also the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. So those are all different lands. So we have Magog, Meshach, Tubal, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Togarma, which in some of your translations will say Beth Togarma. The word Beth is just house of or land of. So house of Togarma. So you can, if your translation says Beth Togarma, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to house of Togarma. And then some of the translations will use the word Rosh. So it will use it and throw that in the mix depending upon the translation that you have. So you may see that land as well. Where are all of these lands? What are the regions and what are the lands that it's talking about that are going to be attacking Magog? Are going to be attacking Israel. Well, if you look at Magog, Magog is the what we call the Stan nations. These are the nations of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and you can also throw into that, you can throw in Pakistan. So the Pakistan area here also would be part of that Stan group. It's just this map that I have here is an old one and it doesn't have that. So Pakistan really broke away from India, and it is really the Muslim region. So we have Kazakhstan, we have Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and those are the Stan nations that we're referring to, and those are the region of Magog. You have the region of Rosh, which that's in some of the translations, that's potentially Russia. Then you have the region of Meshach. Now, what is Meshach? Well, Meshach, Tubal, and Beth Togarma, all of these combined, Meshach, Tubal, and Togmara, these are all Turkey. These are the modern day land of Turkey. And so he says that the ruler is called the Prince of Meshach. So the Prince of Meshach is the Prince of Turkey. It could also be the Gog is also that same one. So it could be one ruler that we are looking at with Turkey and the Magog area potentially. But these are the areas of Turkey. Then you have the area of Persia. That is modern day Iran. You have the area of Cush. These are African countries, Cush and Put, and these are modern day in Africa. So we have Cush being Sudan and Ethiopia, those areas, Sudan and Ethiopia, and then we have Put, which is essentially Libya, and it's also Algeria. So those two areas are the areas of Put, and then we have Gomer. That is also Turkey. So I forgot to write that one up here. So Turkey as well. So if you look, Israel, who is going to be in the middle, is going to be surrounded by these nations that will be coming against it from every direction. So you have Israel being attacked on really every front. Now, the only lands not included in that are some of these other lands of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Yemen, the Gulf states around there. So these regions, though, these areas are going to be coming against Israel with this very mighty army. So what do you have here? Well, you have a coalition of Muslim nations. These are all Muslim nations, and it's a coalition of Muslim nations and Russia. So Russia joining with Muslim nations that are potentially going to be the countries that are coming against Israel. Now, Russia is still an unknown. The Muslim areas, the Muslim countries hate Israel. They do not believe Israel is legitimate. They have an animosity toward Israel to the extent that they want Israel removed from the face of the earth. If you look at the events that just happened this past week in the United States with the passage of some bills, some funding, some budget bills, some funding bills that they were looking at, one of the bills included what we have always done since 1948, and that is giving money to Israel for the aid of their defense. There was $1 billion that is given. And in this bill for the Iron Dome defense system. This Iron Dome defense system is not an offensive weapon. It is truly a defensive weapon. If it were not for the Iron Dome defense system, all of the missiles and rockets that were launched toward Israel back several months ago, the battles that were going on there at that time, they would have caused major damage to the nation of Israel. But because of the Iron Dome defense system, they were able to shoot down a massive number of these missiles that were coming in. In this bill, it was the $1 billion to give to Israel to help in their defense, to help in the aid of this Iron Dome defense system, this Iron Dome shield to help keep them safe as a country. If they did not have that, they would not be able to exist because there would be too much attacks coming against them. Too much destruction and devastation. We have always given that money to them. We are very pro-Israel as part of our country. But in this hearing and in this vote that was taken on this budget, the so-called squad, who's part of this very, very far left progressive movement, is very anti-Semitic at nature, and they stood up in opposition against giving Israel any money because they feel like Israel is an illegitimate country that is illegitimate people that is ruling that area. They believe that Israel has committed war crimes. They are very anti-Semitic. Well, that is the attitude of the Muslim nations toward Israel today. They are invaders in the land. They do not deserve to have the land. They need to be wiped out and eradicated from the land, and they will do anything in their power to do this. So what we have here in Ezekiel chapter 38 is a future war of a coalition of nations that are all Muslim nations and Russia coming against the nation of Israel, where we have the stand nations, we have Iran, we have Turkey, most likely Syria will probably join in the mix as well. Then we have the African nations, which are all Muslim nations that are doing very atrocious things toward the people, toward Christians in that land. And so watch for these events to take place, because God said this is what's going to happen. Now, if God had already said that Israel would be taken away as a nation and brought back as a nation, and if God did what he said, then we have to take seriously the fact that he is going to do this as well, that he will do what he says he is going to do. So be watching for that, because these events have been prophesied about by God, and we know that God always keeps his word. He always keeps his promises. Well, let's go back to the verses we just read. So we read in these words, and I want to point out to you something here that is very unique. That we understand that these locations, that they're all Muslim nations, they're coming against Israel. But I want you to notice what it says here. The word of God came to Ezekiel saying, Son of man, set your face toward these countries and say to them, God says, I am against you. Gog, chief prince of Meshech. Now, a lot of people think the Gog reference, this is the ruler, that this is a reference to the Antichrist. That the Antichrist will be the ruler of these coalitions of nations that will come against Israel. And it doesn't have to just stop at the nations that I listed. Those are just the thoughts of what they could be. There are other nations that could be in the mix that will come against Israel. So God says, I am against you. But I want you to notice what this says, and this is really a unique thought. God says to Gog and to the nations, the coalition of nations coming against Israel, God says, look, I will turn you. I will turn you about, and I will put hooks in your jaws. Now, think about a horse with reins, and if you want to turn a horse, you just pull on the reins. God is saying, I'm going to put a hook in your jaw so that I can turn you. God says, I will do this. So he says, I will. I'm going to turn you. I will. He says, I will. Come on, pen. I will bring you out. I will bring you out with all your army. God is saying that he is the one behind these events that are going to happen. I want you to let that play around in your mind. God is in control. God, in his sovereignty and in his control and in his authority, is bringing nations against Israel for this battle to occur. God is not just saying these are the things that are going to happen. God is saying, I am behind the scenes and I am allowing this to happen. I am making this happen. I will cause this to happen. I will bring out Gog, Antichrist, your army against Israel. I will turn you and push you toward Israel. It reminds me of the book of Job. I don't know if you remember in the book of Job, if you've read it in a while, but in the book of Job, at the beginning of Job, Satan comes to God and he's having a conversation with God, which is odd to me that they would have this conversation, but nevertheless, it's happening. He comes before God and God says to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? That's the same kind of thought. He's putting this thought out there before Satan. Satan says, well, he won't worship you if you wouldn't have, protected him the way that you do. Let me touch him. Let me hurt him. Let me destroy him. And he will turn and reject you. Now, in the end of the book, Job has repented and really followed God with a deeper heart and attitude than he ever did. That's kind of the same scenario that will happen here. God is saying, well, have you considered my nation Israel? I will bring you against Israel. Satan is saying, no, they will turn their backs on you. God is saying, no, they will actually turn and follow me when you come against them. God is saying, I will bring them out with your army. So this enemy coalition, I will bring their army against my nation Israel. I will bring them with horses and horsemen. All of these splendidly dressed, a vast assembly with breastplate and shield, all of them wielding swords. Now we know that in a future battle, it's not going to be done on horses and horsemen with a breastplate and shield wielding swords. However, in the day of Ezekiel, if God had said, I'm going to bring them out with missiles and tanks and fighter jets, and I'm going to bring them out with grenades and machine guns, nobody would have understood that for thousands of years. It would have not made any sense. They would have read it and not understood the context. So God uses these terms, and we will also see this in the book of Revelation, that he will use these terms, but they have a deeper meaning behind them. So when God says this, it's just a picture of the war that is going to happen. It's not necessarily saying that it's going to happen on horseback with swords. It's going to be this vast army that will come against them. So all of these areas, even to the extreme north and all of their troops, they are going to come against my people Israel. I will make it happen. I will allow it to happen. And there is a reason behind why God allows all of these events to occur. Well, let's keep going with verse 7. So he says, be prepared, prepare yourself, you and all your company gathered around you, be a guard for them. After many days you will be summoned. In the latter years, the latter years, you will come against the land that has been brought back from the sword and regathered from many peoples on the mountains of Israel, which has been a continual waste. But they were brought out from the peoples. When all of them are dwelling securely, you, Gog, will come up. You will come like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all of your troops and many peoples with you. So God is talking not to Israel here. God is talking to Gog. So he's talking to Gog. He's talking to the Antichrist. And he's saying, be prepared. Prepare yourself. You and all your company gathered around you. After many days. So what is this a reference to? This is a reference to the end. These are all reference to the end times events. After many days, in the latter years, in the end times, after many days, Gog will come against what? Israel. Who is Israel? Well, God says, the land that has been brought back. This land has been brought back from the sword after battles, after persecutions, after destruction. Think of what happened to the Jewish people, the Israelis in Germany during World War II. They were under the sword. They were being executed. They were being persecuted. They were being pursued and destroyed. They will, after that, be brought back. They will be regathered from many peoples on the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. So again, it's a reference to Israel from 70 AD all the way until 1948. It had been a continual waste. At World War II, at the conclusion of World War II, the Jewish people had been under the sword. The Jews had been executed, persecuted, pursued, and destroyed. Then God brings them back. That happened. Those events happened. God says, I will bring you back. And then there will be a period of time that Israel will undergo growth and develop and technological advances, and they will have agricultural and technological growing and discoveries and incredible things that happen and come out of Israel. And there will be coming a time where they will start to dwell safely in the land. Now, that is not there yet. They are not there. There's a degree of security, there is a degree of safety, but they are not dwelling securely as of yet because they still face threats from multiple fronts every day. There are threats from all of Iran and Iran's proxies around the region that are constantly coming after Israel. They do not have safety. So what can we be looking for? Well, you can be looking for this term that he just said, look for Israel to be dwelling securely. When they are dwelling securely. Now, what would that possibly mean to dwell securely? Well, my theory is the dwelling securely will be some kind of a peace treaty. There will be some kind of a covenant. There will be some kind of an agreement. If you go back to the book of Daniel that we just studied, we learned that there will be a peace covenant, that the Antichrist will make a covenant with the people of Israel. He will basically say, you have every right to have the land. We will let you worship in peace. We will be at peace with you. But the Antichrist will break its treaty. In the middle of the events, it will break the treaty. He will break the treaty and turn and attack Israel. Well, that's the same thing that it's saying here. They will dwell securely. When the people of God are dwelling securely, then at that point they will attack. This is where the battle will occur, when the people are dwelling securely, because the Antichrist will break his peace treaty, he will break his covenant and come up. And God says, you will come up. You will come like a storm. It will be a blitzkrieg like the world has never seen before. This blitzkrieg will be like, he says here, a cloud covering the land. You and all of your troops and many peoples with you. So do you understand the timeline? Israel comes back into the land. Israel has great success in the land. Israel has growth technologically, agriculturally. The land blossoms. All of the land is under their control. A peace treaty occurs, and they are starting to dwell securely in the land. And then the Antichrist will make a peace treaty with them, a covenant with them. But when it's in his best interest, he will break the covenant and he will come against the people like a storm, like a cloud covering the land. This has been the pattern, by the way, of the Muslim empires from the beginning of time. Muhammad had a peace agreement and broke that peace agreement quickly when it was in his best interest to take over and take control. This is the nature of what they will do. They will make a peace agreement in order to seem like they are going to be agreeable, and then when it is in their tactical advantage or in their whether it's advantageous in some other way, they will then break the agreement, come against the land. And God is the one behind all of this. He is saying this is what's going to happen. And when will it happen? It will happen in the end times, in the latter years. This is when it's going to happen. So are we there now? Well, it sure seems like it is, because Israel was restored. We know that in 1948 and then later in 1967, when they got Jerusalem back, that these are the key events that trigger the whole end times clock that we are living in today. So what can you be watching for? Watch for Israel to dwell securely. Watch for a coalition of nations to be building up. And we have, by our debacle in Afghanistan, we have basically handed all of this military equipment and control of the Middle East over to these radical Muslim groups. And that could easily cause the buildup of the Antichrist empire, the coalition of nations, the Gog of Magog, the prince of Meshach and Tubal, the coming together of all of these countries, the Persia, the Put, the Cush, all of these countries coming against Israel in the near future, very likely within the next years, within our lifetimes for sure. We will see these events unfolding. Well, let's keep going to some other parts of this that we want to make sure that we understand, and we want to make sure that we cover. So it says, "Thus says Adonai Elohim, it will come to pass in that day that things will come into your heart, and you will devise an evil plan." Again, who's he talking to? He's talking to Gog of Magog. He's talking to the Antichrist. In those days, you will devise an evil, wicked plan. Now, you're going to go up and say, I will go against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the people, the quiet people, who live securely, all of them living without walls, having no bars or gates, in order to seize spoil and carry off plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places now inhabited, and against the people gathered from the nations who have been acquiring livestock and property, who live in the center of the world. So what is the picture of what's going to happen? The Antichrist will say, I'm going to go against. So I'm going to attack Israel. And the purpose of the attack is to plunder. So what is that going to mean? Well, I want you to think about this. Jesus warns that in the end times there will be great famine. Kingdoms will rise against kingdoms, nations, ethnos will rise against ethnos, but picture the great famine. If there is great famine in the land, and if Israel isn't in famine, because God has said you're not going to be, and Israel has livestock, and it says they have property, and if they have grain, and let's say they have a natural gas reserve that they find, or if they have oil reserves that they find, and if they have money, or if they have gold, or if they have technology, and the rest of the Middle East is in famine, why wouldn't the Antichrist say, I'm going to go attack them and take what they have? When will that happen again? Well, it will happen when Israel is at peace and they are feeling secure. And so what does it say about their peace and feeling secure? Well, it says that they have unwalled villages. Why would you put a wall around a village if you're trying to protect it from outsiders, from people coming in against us? If I don't feel safe, I will put up a wall. If I don't feel safe, I'll put in a home security system. If I don't feel safe, I will make sure to have a barrier of some kind. Well, they feel safe, so they don't have walls. They are quiet people. These are people who are living securely. So there's a secure or security that they are experiencing in the land at the time that the Antichrist comes in. They are living without bars. So there's no walls, there's no bars on the windows, there's no gates to enter in. So this is a time of peace and security. They feel secure. And if there is a famine going on in the rest of the Middle East, then they will come against Israel because Israel isn't in famine. Israel instead has gathered livestock and property and money and technology and oil and gas reserves, and they're doing just fine. Their crops are growing. They have been blessed by God. And so if that is the case and that is the scenario, then the Antichrist will look and say, they have it, we don't. We're going after them. We're going to take exactly what they have. So those are the events around what will happen in the end times. Now that matches up, again, this idea of famine with what Jesus says in Matthew 24. When Jesus says in the end times, the disciples say, well, what's going to happen? And Jesus says there will be famines, there will be earthquakes, there will be wars, there will be, in Luke he says there will be pestilences or epidemics or pandemics. So we will have famine, we will have plagues or pandemics that will be going on. We will have wars. Well, think of the Middle East. There will be all wars going on up to that point as the Antichrist does a blitzkrieg across the Middle East and has these nations join him either through conquering them or them bowing down to him. So that's what will go on during that time. So again, let's keep going here in the next verses. Now, this is where we come into play. People always ask, well, where is the United States in the end times events? I believe this is right here where the United States is being referenced for the very first time. So what we have is very much a Middle Eastern conflict. The whole world will be caught up in this, but it will be primarily a Middle East event and a Middle East war that will be going on. So this is a separate group, and there's 3 groups that are mentioned, actually 4 groups that are mentioned. He says, Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, with all of its young lions, will say to you. Who's the you? That's to the Antichrist. That is to Gog. So these countries will say to the Antichrist, to Gog, Have you come to seize spoil? Now they may be saying it because they're coming against them to seize spoil. They will say, have you assembled your company to plunder? So now what is going on here? Well, this is the constant concept of, well, we could just negotiate with them and then they will negotiate. We'll negotiate with them and maybe they'll just be kind. This is the stupidest policy, to try to negotiate with a terrorist or with these Muslim communities who are bent on jihad or bent on war is the most idiotic foreign policy that you could possibly have. But this is nevertheless the status and the attitude and the posture that many countries have taken. We'll just negotiate with them. Let's just give them money. If we can give them money, maybe they'll just back down. So let's write them, trillions of dollars worth of, or give them trillions of dollars worth of money, and let's give them all kinds of material things. Let's give them all kinds of weaponry. Maybe they'll just back down and they won't plunder Israel like we're hoping. Let's just try to negotiate with them, and they don't negotiate. The Antichrist, God, will not negotiate. So when they say, well, have you come to seize spoil? That it's not going to work. We will not negotiate with them. The answer is yes, they're going to take it. You can give them all kinds of money, they're going to take it. So this idea of negotiating this Iran nuclear deal, where just this past week the United States announced we're going to try to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. Well, Iran has now said, well, you broke it, so you have to give us even more than we had before. Well, they don't negotiate. They will say to your face, we won't build nuclear weapons for the purpose of destruction. We just want to build our infrastructure. We want to have nuclear power for our own infrastructure. Well, that's a lie. They will use it for their own ideas and their own advancement and their own military campaigns to go against the people that stand in their way. Have you assembled your company to plunder? Can we just negotiate? Can we write up a new contract with you? What can we give you to appease you? Are you trying to carry away the silver and the gold and take away livestock and property to make off with immense spoils? Well, the answer is yes, but they will just take advantage of these countries any way that they can. So what are these countries? Well, these are the important things to understand when it comes to, again, how we play into these end times events. So what is Sheba? Well, Sheba is what are the modern day Gulf states that are around Saudi Arabia. So what does Sheba consist of? Well, Sheba consists of the countries of Yemen. Now, Yemen's a wild card in this because they have you don't know which way Yemen is going to turn, but it sounds like they will be part of Sheba being the Gulf states. You have Oman, you have Bahrain, and then you have the UAE. That's probably the biggest one in this, the UAE, United Arab Emirates. And then you have Qatar, which will be a part of this as well, and possibly even Kuwait. So these are the Gulf states, and these are the ones that are referred to as Sheba. Now, these are the ones that are going to stay out of the conflict. So they want no part of the empire. No part of the empire, of the Antichrist empire. They want to stay out of it. They want to stay out of the mix. Now, if you look at these countries, we have the UAE and we have Bahrain, who has already entered into the Abraham Accords, the peace agreement. Do not be surprised if you see these other countries enter into the Abraham Accords peace agreement at some time. They're clearly siding with and wanting no part of war and conflict. They want to let Israel just exist as a nation. Then you have the country of Dedan, or the region of Dedan. Now, what is Dedan? Well, that is modern-day Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia right now is in the midst of discussing the Abraham Accords. They have indicated, even this past week, that they don't intend to join the Abraham Accords, but do not be surprised if they also join the Abraham Accords. They are part of the region that doesn't want anything to do with the beastly empire, the Antichrist empire. They want to stay out of war, and they want to just let Israel exist, and let's just all get along. That's their attitude. Then you have Tarshish, and this is where I believe the United States is going to come into play. So we have Tarshish. Not only do you have Tarshish, but you have all of its young lions. Now, most scholars and theologians, and I would be in agreement with this, believe that Tarshish would represent the British Empire, or at this point, it would represent the UK. Now, why would how could the UK be separated maybe from Europe? Well, because of Brexit. Brexit has enabled the UK to step away from the European Union and to be separate from them. They are most likely the merchants of Tarshish with all of its young lions. Now, what are the young lions? Well, the young lions are parts of the original British Empire that really all are very close relationship with the UK today. Now, who would that include? Well, that would include the United States. That would include Canada. That would include Australia. That would also include New Zealand. And it could potentially include India as well. India being broken off from Pakistan, Pakistan being the Muslim nation, India having nothing to do with the Muslim empires. India very likely could be part of the Young Lions group. So what will happen? Well, the Middle Eastern countries of the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, who are very close trading partners with all of the Tarshish countries, they will try to come to the negotiating table with the Antichrist and his beastly empire and say, can't we just negotiate? Can we just agree to not do destruction? What can we give you? How can we appease you? How can we come down to your level? How can we give you what you want to have for you not to go to war with Israel? Well, that's the picture of what's going on here. And that is how the United States ties into all of these events. So in summary, and I'm going to stop it there because we're out of time today, but in summary, what do you have? Well, you have Israel, who came back into existence, 1948, 1967, two important dates. During that time, they have grown and they have flourished to today. Where we are at today, Israel is starting to have a little bit of peace. They don't have it yet. They're not securely dwelling in the land yet, but they are moving in that direction. They have countries that will have agreed. Foundations have been laid, but when the Antichrist's empire stands up, the Antichrist will negotiate a peace agreement with Israel, only to break that agreement later, and then the Antichrist will come against by attacking Israel. When that happens, or when they are doing this blitzkrieg across the Middle East, the countries or the regions of Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish, along with the young lions, will try to negotiate with the Antichrist, which will do no good. They will still come against Israel to destroy. Now, what is the motivation behind it? The motivation behind it, in my opinion, is going to be great famine, great problems that are happening in the Middle East. But Israel is flourishing, and since we're in famine and Israel is flourishing, we are going to attack and we are going to plunder and we are going to take what is theirs because they don't rightfully deserve the land in the first place. They are there and they should not be there. They are there as invaders to the land. They are there who are, they're war criminals. They have to have the land removed from them. They call them dogs. They are those who are illegally occupying the land of Israel that we know as Israel today. Well, we're going to stop there because we are out of time, and I hope that that was helpful. And we're going to pick it up in chapter 38, verse 14 next week on our next study as we go through prophecy, the end times, and eventually the book of Revelation. Thanks for joining me today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to being with you again next week.